Hi class, I hope you had a good weekend. In the previous session, I had you work in your groups to discuss the differences between the three models of memory that we've learned so far. Essays in the cognitive approach are slightly different from that in the biological approach, since most of them will require you to outline and explain a model of memory or thinking and decision making in the essay. I think this question contrasts two models of memory with reference to research studies may be the most different and unfamiliar to you. So I will focus the next few minutes to run you through how you could answer a question with the contrast command term. So to begin with, what is this question really asking you to do? Okay, I'm going to run you through it first as the criteria and then go into how you would divide your essay. Okay. So to begin with, the focus, which is for 2 marks, it will require you to be very intentional and explicit in contrasting between the two chosen models, okay? You have to be very clear in making points of difference, okay? It's not asking you to compare the similarities, it is asking you to contrast the differences, okay? So if you go ahead and discuss the similarities, it's not going to fetch you any points, and you might also lose points for focus. Okay, so it's asking you for contrasting and not comparing. Okay, so please make sure that you don't mess that up and confuse yourself with that. So knowledge and understanding, here you are required to clearly outline the two models. Outlining here means that you don't have to go into too much depth of it. Okay, you don't have to describe every single or explain everything in great detail. You just kind of have to say like, okay, so Atkinson and Sheffrin's model describes how information flows from the sensory register to the short-term memory and long-term memory, and that there are certain conditions that need to be met for it to go from one store to the other, and what are these conditions. And finally, that the capacity and durations are these in short term and these in long term. I think that's basically enough. You could draw a diagram if you think that will support your answer. It's not necessary, but I think it could be helpful. Okay, and so again, you have to outline the two models. This will show that you have a clear understanding of the model. Again, don't go in too much detail with the model. Okay, so then you will go into research. Here, research, again, like I said before, it's not asking you about knowing the details of the research. Here, you have to use research to support the model, which means that the focus should be on the results, what the results were, okay? And just like a general understanding of what the procedure was. You don't have to go into too much detail about it being an independent measures design and it having opportunistic sampling and who the sample was, okay? Because the question is not asking you to evaluate the research, okay? It's asking you to contrast two models, so your focus should be that. You will provide research nonetheless to support this model. And here, when I say breadth of research, okay, rather than going into the depth of the research, which would be then discussing the procedure as it was done, breadth of research may be providing several different researches that support the model. So if it's for multi-store model, I could use Glanzer and Kunitz, and I could also use HM's case study, which I will very briefly describe and explain how it supports that the idea that there are separate stores. Okay, so breadth of research is what I want you to focus on, not the depth of research. Okay, critical thinking, you have no need to evaluate the studies. Again, the question is not asking you to evaluate the studies. It's asking a very specific thing of you. Okay, so there is no need to evaluate the studies, whether it was a reliable procedure. All of those things are not going to fetch you any points for critical thinking in this question, in this command term kind of question. Okay, rather your focus on, or the way you can showcase critical thinking is by showing that you understand these models and how they're different, okay, and provide solid points contrasting the two models. Okay, that is where you will get your 6 points for critical thinking, not in saying that the research procedure was reliable and valid, and the sample was enough to generalize it to general population. Those are things that you do not need to focus on for this essay. Okay, and finally, I think it would be good for you to actually look at the model and maybe the drawbacks of it and the strengths of it. Okay, you don't have to do it as different points, but you can use it as comparisons. Okay, for example, the multi-store model suggests that information just travels in one direction, which is quite limiting because we know we are constantly accessing information from our long-term store. So this drawback is you evaluating the model, but also showing a difference by then extending it to the fact that the working memory model looks at how we are retrieving information from our long-term memory to make sense of our current situation. And you can see that in the phonological, the visual-spatial sketchpad, where you can visualize what is coming in from our senses, but also from our long-term. Okay, so evaluation can be done in that sense, where you're picked up maybe a drawback and you've extended it by saying, okay, while this is a drawback for the multi-store model, it is compensated in the working memory model by blah, blah, blah. Okay, so again, do not evaluate the studies. That is not what is asked of you. And finally, organization. Developing the contrast throughout the essay is very important. I don't want you to have just like a last paragraph or conclusion contrasting the two models, because that will just fetch you very low scores all around, okay? Especially for critical thinking, focus, research, not so much, knowledge and understanding. Maybe you'd lose a few points, but you would also lose points for organization. So you need to make sure that there is some consistency in you contrasting throughout the essay. Okay, so this is the breakdown of what is expected per criteria. If I had to break it down into paragraphs, okay, so there's the first one, which is going to define what memory is and the purpose of formulating models, right? We know that memory is a very complicated process. So by formulating models, we're trying to understand how information is encoded, retrieved, and recalled in our cognitive processes. So then you will identify the two models that you're referring to for this essay and that you will be contrasting, and you will describe the two models in a brief line. Okay, so for example, multi-store model is one that tries to understand the structure of memory. Okay, so that is a brief line, and you can then say this essay will focus on contrasting the two. Okay, then you will go into outlining the first model. Again, I said you do not have to go in depth. Okay, just an outline so that we get a gist of what that model is about. You can again use a diagram if you want. So paragraph 3, you could combine these two paragraphs, but I personally would prefer to have it as two different paragraphs. So here you will provide research to support model 1, which is the multi-store model, if that's what you've chosen. Okay, it'll be very brief. You do not need to mention sample procedure in too much detail. And again, I would almost use two researches if I could, to use the results from it to support the idea that there are multiple stores or multiple components of memory. Okay, so use the results, focus on the results and how that relates to the model. So when I go into paragraph 4, again, I will not be evaluating the study. I will be evaluating the model, which will then contrast with model 2. Even though you have not introduced model 2 yet, we know that that is the model you'll be focusing on from your introduction. Okay, so you will make points of contrast in this paragraph. Okay, and I would do it in a way that I focus on the things that model 1 has. Okay, so model 1 is structural and it explains, I'm talking about multi-store model, it is structural and it understands how information flows right from the environment into our long-term memory, which again, the working memory model doesn't do. It focuses primarily on the structure and the processing of the short-term memory. Okay, so that would be something that the multi-store model has and the working memory model doesn't have. So I think I would do it that way, by focusing my paragraph on what the multi-store model has and contrasting it to what it doesn't, what the working memory model doesn't have. Okay. So then I will go into outlining the second model, and if I would recommend to choose the working memory model. It just has a lot more points to contrast with the multi-store model. And then I would provide one research, again, very briefly outline it, and then go into the evaluation of the second model, and then contrast it very intentionally, very explicitly to model one. Okay? And here again, I would personally do something that the working memory model has that the multi-store model doesn't have. So here I would say the working memory model does not view short-term memory as a unitary store, that it looks at it as having several components to it, okay, which is something that is different from how the multi-store model viewed the short-term memory. Okay, so again, I would choose what it has and compare it to what multi-store model doesn't have. That just helps me structure points in my head, and I think also would give structure to your essay as a whole. And then you just conclude with a few tying in points, which would show that these are the main differences. Okay, so if you have any questions, please let me know. You will focus on writing this answer for the rest of the class. I will see by the end of class where you are at. If I feel like we haven't made progress as a whole, you will get more time in the next class to work on this question. Okay, and we will decide the due date accordingly.